For our overview of what we're going to cover, we're just going to use one of ACT's tools. This is the Insert Note dialog box, where we would put a note in for a contact. And we'll talk later on about how we would use this with ACT. But for now, I'm just going to use it as a tool to help highlight some of the things that we're going to talk about. So we're going to start off with the basics. When I talk about the basics, what I'm talking about is the basics of contact management software, and specifically the basics of ACT, which is, how do I start it up? How do I work with contacts? What about some terminology in regards to ACT? And then we'll talk about browsing records and a little bit about layouts. After we get done talking about the basics, we'll talk about working with our contacts. In working with our contacts, we're going to be focusing on inserting new contacts, locating contacts, lookup variations, different ways that we can set up lookups, customizing contact lists. We'll talk about how we can set up ACT so that we can quickly get information from ACT to make us more productive. To be productive, you actually have to go out and do something as well. So we'll talk about scheduling our day with ACT. When we discuss scheduling our day, we'll be talking about setting up appointments, setting up to-dos, to-do lists, just things that we want to do, setting up reminders for the appointments, being able to view the notes and history of a contact record before we go out and see somebody so we can become more familiar with the account. We can set up task lists so that we can keep ourselves more productive and always be doing the most important thing. We'll talk about setting up activities that recur. In other words, if you have a meeting and it's always on the second Tuesday of the month, well, can you set that up so that you're automatically reminded of that meeting, say, the day before? And yes, you can with ACT. So we'll talk about how we can use ACT, and we'll look at how we can use ACT to schedule our day and to make sure that we're doing the most productive thing that we can do on each day. Then we'll talk about querying ACT. When we talk about querying ACT, we're talking about getting all the information that we can out of the system and getting it the way that we want it. In other words, if we want to find out how many people in a certain zip code bought a certain amount of product, we can do that from ACT. We can set up lookups by example. We can do some advanced querying. So we'll take a look at what ACT is capable of in regards to queries. We can query by individual, but we can also use groups and companies. For example, let's say that a company has just recently changed their address. They moved. And we have hundreds of contacts for that company on our database. Well, instead of changing all those hundreds of contacts, and instead of having to go in and change that address, we can change the company address, and anything that is attached to that company then will be changed. So you can see how much easier and how much faster that would be just to change the company address than to have to go through and change each one. And the whole idea is to be more productive. Now, if we've got all this information in our system, then certainly we can use it as tools, right, as a tool to create letters, to create memos, to create things that are in written form. And we're going to call that getting it in writing. In other words, if we want to quickly be able to create letters and faxes and memos out of our system, we can do that, and we can even create templates that we can use so that, again, we can remain more productive. We're going to talk about how we can create mail merges, how we can use ACT to print envelopes and labels, and of course one of the ways that people communicate in today's business is email, and we can easily tie our ACT system into our current email system, into our Outlook email system. So we're going to talk about how we can integrate ACT with Microsoft Outlook and what the other internet services are that are available in ACT. But it all comes down to the dollar sometimes, and we need to be able to track sales opportunities and find out what happened. In other words, be able to track where the dollars went or where that opportunity went, whether we get the sale or whether we don't get the sale, tracking opportunities in many organizations is extremely important. So we'll talk about how we track opportunities and what kind of tools that ACT has built into it to track opportunities. So as you can see, just the built-in program, the database that we've looked at so far, has a tremendous number of tools to help us to be more productive. But in addition to that, we can actually do a little bit of database design of our own. We can design our own database and we can design our own reports. So we'll talk about database and report design as part of our training. And we'll talk about how we can set these things up so that they're best for us. So in database and report design, we'll talk about how we can customize the reporting so that it is best for us. And then, of course, we have to be able to administer the system. So we'll talk about database administration, which has to do with managing users and also has to do with creating backups and restoring the system if need be. And then finally, in today's world, you're not always tied to the office. Some people really like that, other people really don't. But as part of our productivity tools section, we're going to discuss how we make ACT even more productive by being able to tie it into our PDAs and make it a much more productive tool for what we need in today's business. So as you can see, we've got a lot to talk about. So let's go ahead and get started with ACT Basics. That's next.